Welcome back, class. Today we are talking about colonial America still, and we were talking about another religious or another group of people that were looking for religious freedom. The Pilgrims were like that; they were separatists, but the Puritans were a little bit different. They didn't really want to separate from the Church of England. They wanted to just uh, make changes to it from within. All right, and that's the way the Puritans were. Like I said, Pilgrims wanted to separate. They wanted to get away from them. The Puritans, they just wanted to change things from within, but they were also being kind of persecuted, and that's why they left for religious freedom, the same as the Pilgrims. That's why they came to America, or came to the New World. It was not called America at the time. Uh, so, who were these Puritans? Like I said, they were English Christians who did not agree with the practices of the Church of England. You know, they were different from separatists. You know, which Pilgrims, like I said, they were separatists, but they wanted to stay with the Church of England, but change the practices within the church. They wanted to change things within the church. So, the separatists, on the other hand, like the Pilgrims, they wanted to leave the church and start their own church, and that's what they did.
Who were the Puritans? The Puritans were English Christians who did not agree with the practices of the Church of England. They were different from the separatists. Many of the Pilgrims were separatists in that they wanted to stay with the Church of England, but change the practices from within the church. The separatists, on the other hand, wanted to leave the Church of England and start their own church.
All right, so what did the Puritans believe? The Puritans wanted the Reformed Church to be very different from the Catholic Church, and that's what the Church of England was. It was a Catholic Church. Uh, they wanted to keep things simple. Their services simple. They wanted things centered around the Bible. They didn't want to have decorations in the church. They didn't have any musical instruments. They weren't allowed to play inside the church. But the Puritans were Christians who followed the philosophies of John Calvin. This is John Calvin right here. And they believed that faith, not works, was the key to salvation. This is what it would have looked like in one of their churches back then.
What did the Puritans believe? The Puritans wanted the Reformed Church to be very different from the Catholic Church. Their church services were simple and were centered around the Bible. The church building itself was simple with few decorations. No musical instruments were allowed to be played inside the church. The Puritans were Christians who followed the philosophies of John Calvin and believed that faith, not works, was the key to salvation.
All right. So, like the Pilgrims, they were being persecuted in England. Okay, the Puritans moved to America in order to escape that persecution, escape being ridiculed, escape being thrown in jail, the same way that the Pilgrims were. And all English subjects were expected to be members of the Church of England. So, being a Puritan was a crime; it was illegal, and people who practiced Puritanism had a tough time in England then, and things got really, really hard in the 1620s and the 1630s when the Catholic Archbishop decided, hey, it's time to wipe out Puritanism in all of England. So that's when they really started, you know what, we're going to get out of here so we don't lose our heads or anything.
Why did they move to America? The Puritans moved to America in order to practice their religion free from persecution. All English subjects were expected to be members of the Church of England. Being a Puritan was illegal, and people who practiced Puritanism had a tough time in England. Things got especially difficult for Puritans in England around the 1620s and 1630s when the Catholic Archbishop decided it was time to wipe out Puritanism in England.
So in 1630, 11 ships that was led by John Winthrop, this man right here, all right, they arrived in New England carrying more than 700 Puritan settlers. So they had 700 Puritan settlers. And right here is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's what we're talking about today, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So we've talked about Roanoke. We've talked about Lost Colony Roanoke. We've talked about Jamestown. We've talked about the Plymouth Colony. And now we're talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. All right. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony was settled near the modern day city of Boston. John Winthrop, like I said, he served as the governor of the new colony, and he wanted it to be a city on the hill. He wanted it to be an example of how a Protestant society could flourish.
Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1630, 11 ships led by John Winthrop, arrived in New England carrying more than 700 Puritan settlers. They established the Massachusetts Bay Colony and settled near the modern-day city of Boston. John Winthrop served as governor of the new colony. He wanted it to be a city on a hill, a passage from the Bible that would be an example to Europe of how a Protestant society could flourish.
All right, so during this time period, that was in 1630, from 1630 to 1640, the next 10 years is referred to as the Great Migration. All right, the Great Migration. And it was during this time that about 20,000 Puritans moved from England to New England. And many of these families continued, they kept having children and allowing the colony to keep growing and growing. So they started out with 700 settlers. And in the next 10 years, they had 20,000 Puritans that had migrated to New England from England. And if you look right here, some of the routes they went migrating from the Great Migration.
The Great Migration. The next 10 years is sometimes referred to as the Great Migration. During this time, around 20,000 Puritans moved from England to New England. Many of these immigrants were families who continued to have children, allowing the colony to grow quickly in population.
All right. So the Puritan leaders of this Massachusetts Bay Colony, they had really strict rules, very strict rules, okay, and regulations regarding how their church was run, what you could do in church. And people who disagreed with them, they tended to get rid of them. All right. They forced them to leave the colony. Some of these people would leave, and they would form new colonies to the south of Massachusetts, including Rhode Island and Connecticut. So they started out in Massachusetts Bay here. And then you had Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson who left, started Rhode Island and Massachusetts Bay, or Rhode Island colony and Portsmouth colony. And then you had Thomas Hooker who left and started the Connecticut colony, which we'll talk about more on the next page or next slides.
New Puritan colonies. The Puritan leaders of Massachusetts Bay Colony had very strict rules and regulations regarding their church. People who disagreed with them were often forced to leave the colony. Some of these people formed new colonies to the south of Massachusetts, including Rhode Island and Connecticut.
All right, so Roger Williams, he was a Puritan religious leader, and he believed that government should be separate from the church. He didn't think government and church should be together. He thought they'd be separate. So, and he also thought people should have more religious freedom than what they did, what the Puritans were allowing. And they didn't like that. So guess what? They kicked him out. Said bye, Felicia. And he was banished from Massachusetts. And so he formed his own settlement called Providence in 1636.
Rhode Island and Providence. Roger Williams was a Puritan religious leader who believed that government should be separate from the church. He also thought that people should have more religious freedom. He was banished from Massachusetts and formed his own settlement called Providence in 1636.
This is Roger Williams right here, and this is Ann Hutchinson, by the way. So another Puritan leader, Ann Hutchinson, spoke out against Puritan leaders from Massachusetts. Well, they didn't like it. She was a woman, first of all, so they didn't like that. They didn't really want you speaking out if you were a woman at the time. Like I said, they had no rights. She said they were focused on works for salvation and not faith, and they believed in faith, not works. So she was banished as well, and so she left and she started her own settlement of Portsmouth in 1638. This is Ann Hutchinson. Eventually, these two got together and they formed their own colony together.
Rhode Island and Providence continued. Another Puritan leader, Ann Hutchinson, spoke out against the Puritan leaders of Massachusetts. She said they were focused on works for salvation and not faith. She was banished as well and started the settlement of Portsmouth in 1638. And
when they got together, I didn't say this in the slides, but when they got together, they formed Rhode Island. All right, that was the colony that they formed when they brought the two colonies together.
Rhode Island and Providence.
All right, and then you had Connecticut. That was another one that was south below Massachusetts Bay Colony. A prominent leader in Massachusetts was Thomas Hooker. This is Thomas Hooker. He formed the colony of Connecticut in 1636 after a disagreement over who should have the right to vote. So he thought they should have the right to vote. Well, guess what? He didn't get banished, but he left anyway, and he started the colony of Connecticut. And Connecticut became the first colony to have its own written constitution and created a formal government. So that was a big deal because it was the first time any of the colonies had a written constitution and formal government.
Connecticut. Another prominent Puritan leader in Massachusetts, Thomas Hooker, formed the colony of Connecticut in 1636 after a disagreement over who should have the right to vote. Connecticut became the first colony to have its own written constitution that created a formal government.
All right, so comprehension question. Why did the Puritans leave England? All right, A, to escape religious persecution, B, because they could, or C, they were looking for gold. The answer is A, just like the Pilgrims, they wanted to escape religious persecution.
Ding, 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 we have a winner.
All right, number 2, what colony did the Puritans first establish in 1630? Was it A, Jamestown, B, Massachusetts Bay, or C, Roanoke? It is B, Massachusetts Bay.
Ding, 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 we have a winner.
Remember, Jamestown was the first permanent settlement, and Roanoke was the lost colony. It could have been the first permanent settlement, but they still don't know exactly what happened to everybody. But this was Massachusetts Bay. Number 3, who was the leader of the first group of Puritan settlers? Who was the leader of the first group of Puritan settlers that came over to Massachusetts Bay? Was it A, John Calvin, B, John Smith, or C, John Winthrop? The answer is C, John Winthrop.
Ding, 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 we have a winner.
John Smith was one of the leaders of Jamestown colony, and John Calvin they believed in his philosophies. Okay, John Calvin's whose philosophies that the Puritans believed in. And number 4, what Puritan leader formed the colony of Connecticut? Was it A, Thomas Hooker, B, John Calvin, or C, John Winthrop? It is A, Thomas Hooker. He had a disagreement over who should vote, so he didn't like it, so he left and started his own colony and called it Connecticut, and it had the first written government or constitution.
Ding, ding, ding,
the colonies.
We have a winner.
And number 5, what 2 people formed Rhode Island when they came together? A, no one, B, Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson, or C, Mr. Betts? The answer is Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson. They both left. They both got banished from the colonies. And Ann Hutchinson started Portsmouth. Roger Williams started Providence. And when Providence and Portsmouth came together, they formed Rhode Island.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, class, that's it for today. I'll be back next week with more Colonial America. We've covered quite a few weeks in it now, but we're about halfway through, and we will have more. So I will see you all later.